Somewhere right now, you're paying rent to someone who's never met you, and taxes to people you've never voted for. And you've probably never once stopped to ask, how did that become normal? It started with one man. Not a legend, a real person, so far back in history that for centuries, his existence lived somewhere between history and myth. His name was Enmebaragesi, king of Kish, around 4,700 years ago. And then archaeologists found something extraordinary, an ancient stone vessel fragment bearing his name and his title, King of Kish. That tiny fragment gave us something incredibly rare, direct archaeological evidence for one of the earliest kings known from Mesopotamian tradition. But here's the part that should make you wonder. Kingship didn't just mean one man wearing a crown. It meant other people accepted that he had the right to command them. So here's the real question. How do you get free people to agree to that? Imagine standing in a small human camp 10,000 years ago. You stand up and announce, "From now on, you answer to me." What happens? People laugh. Maybe someone mocks you. Maybe they tell everyone what you just said. And if you keep pushing, they can do something even more powerful. They can leave. For most of human history, that was one of the simplest ways human groups prevented any one person from becoming too powerful. Anthropologists have documented versions of this behavior in surviving hunter-gatherer societies. In the Kalahari Desert, among the Juhoansi people, there's a tradition anthropologist Richard Lee called insulting the meat. When a hunter brings back a massive kill, an animal that could feed the whole camp for days, the group doesn't celebrate him. They mock him. They call his kill scrawny, worthless, a waste of an arrow. One hunter explained the reason to Lee. When a young man kills much meat, he comes to think of himself as a chief or a big man, and he thinks of the rest of us as his servants or inferiors. We can't accept this. That's not cruelty. That's prevention. The group was making sure one successful hunter never became everyone's master, because if you don't like the way one person is behaving, you don't necessarily have to defeat him. You can just stop following him. Or, in this case, make sure he never starts thinking he's better than you in the first place. And that's the part we forget when we look backward at kings. Humans weren't naturally walking around waiting for someone to put a crown on their head. People could be respected. A great hunter could have influence. A skilled storyteller could be listened to. An experienced elder could be trusted. But influence isn't authority. Respect isn't obedience. And a person being important isn't the same thing as a person having the right to command everyone else. So if humans had spent hundreds of thousands of years living this way, how did we get from that to kings? The answer begins with something that sounds completely harmless. People stopped moving. Once humans began settling permanently, something fundamental changed. Your home was here. Your fields were here. Your grain was here. Your animals were here. And suddenly, walking away wasn't as simple as disappearing into the forest. Imagine your neighbor has a terrible harvest. You have enough grain to survive, so you lend him some. Next year, maybe he pays you back. But then the harvest fails again, and now he owes you more. That debt isn't just a number anymore. It creates a relationship. You helped him survive. He owes you. And when relationships like that spread through an entire settlement, something strange begins to happen. People become connected by obligations they didn't necessarily choose. The person with the most grain can lend the most. The person with the most animals can accumulate the most wealth. The person with the most wealth can support more followers. And the person with more followers suddenly has something a lone hunter never had, power that doesn't disappear when someone walks away. By the early dynastic period in Mesopotamia, that power was becoming something much bigger than one wealthy household. Cities had rulers. Cities had armies. And one of the earliest rulers we can connect to direct archaeological evidence is Enmebaragesi, king of Kish. Sumerian tradition remembers him as a ruler who defeated Elam. Whether every detail of that ancient account is literally true is impossible to know. But the important part is this. Someone had acquired enough authority and resources to command organized violence beyond his own household. That's what happens when obligation scales up. A harvest becomes wealth. Wealth becomes followers. Followers become power. And power can become an army. But here's the dangerous part. Once an army exists to defend the ruler's power, the ruler doesn't have to be the strongest man anymore. He just has to control the system. And once that happens, Power doesn't have to die with the man who built it. It can be passed on. And that's when power starts multiplying. Think about what happens when wealth, protection, and status start feeding each other. A wealthy ruler can support followers. Followers protect the ruler. Protection makes the ruler more powerful. Power attracts alliances. Alliances create even more wealth. And eventually, the ruler's children inherit the entire machine. They don't have to build it from nothing. They inherit the followers, the wealth, the alliances, the name, and most importantly, the expectation that they are supposed to rule. This is where something completely new appears. Power stops being only about what one person can personally do. It becomes something other people help maintain. And Enmebaragesi wasn't remembered only as a man who fought. Later Sumerian tradition also associated him with building at Nippur, including the Ekur, the great temple of the god Enlil. Think about what that means. His power wasn't just on a battlefield anymore. It was becoming part of the city itself, part of its temples, part of its institutions, part of the story people told about their own past. And once power becomes embedded in the institutions around you, you don't have to personally convince everyone to obey anymore. The system starts doing some of the work for you. But there was still one problem. People could still ask the most dangerous question of all: why him? You can conquer a city with weapons, but you can't keep a dynasty alive forever with weapons. Eventually someone asks the dangerous question: why does his family get to rule us? And ancient rulers had an answer. Not necessarily, because I'm stronger than you. Something much more powerful. Because this is how the world is supposed to work. The Sumerian king list opens with one of the most revealing statements in ancient political history. Kingship descended from heaven. Think about what that does. If a king simply says, "I deserve to rule," you can argue with him. But if kingship itself is presented as something granted by the gods, then you're no longer arguing about one man's strength. You're questioning the order of the universe. You can raise a sword against a man. It's a lot harder to raise a sword against the gods. And that's why religion mattered so much to ancient kingship. The temples weren't just places where people worshipped. They were where the relationship between the gods, the city, and its ruler was constantly performed. Festivals, offerings, processions, rituals. Again and again, the same message was being reinforced. This is how the world works. And once people grow up inside a system like that, authority doesn't have to be explained from scratch every morning. Children inherit the story. Then they grow up believing it. And that creates something weapons alone never could: legitimacy. But there was still one final problem. What happens when the king dies? Because if everything depends on one man, then his entire system should collapse with him. But it didn't. Enmebaragesi's son, Aga, is also remembered as a king. And that's where the story gets even stranger. In later Sumerian literature, Aga appears as the ruler who confronts Uruk and its king, Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is probably the most famous figure in all of Mesopotamian literature. But the important thing isn't whether every detail of that story happened exactly as later writers told it. The important thing is what the story assumes. Aga didn't need to become king from nothing. He inherited a throne. He inherited a title. He inherited a political identity that existed before him. The man changed. The authority didn't. And that's the truly strange invention hiding underneath the crown. A king can be defeated. A king can be forgotten. A king can die. But the throne survives him. Someone else sits down, and the story continues. That is the moment power becomes bigger than the person holding it. Because once authority belongs to an office, the individual becomes temporary. The position becomes permanent. And that idea is still everywhere around you. Presidents leave office. The presidency remains. CEOs resign. The company remains. Generals retire. The institution remains. The person is temporary. The position survives. And that's why the first kings matter far beyond ancient Mesopotamia. The most important thing they left behind wasn't a palace. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't even a crown. It was an idea that authority could outlive the person who held it. Enmebaragesi has been dead for roughly 4,700 years. His city is gone. His world is gone. But the problem he represents never disappeared. Who gets to command? Why do we accept it? And what makes an institution powerful enough that people obey the person sitting inside it, even when they have never met him? Maybe that's the strangest legacy of the first kings. They didn't just discover how to rule people. They helped create a world where power could survive the person who possessed it.